Today, we're going to continue talking about this first topic, how are traits transmitted from one generation to the next? And we're going to ask the question, do traits mix or not? Today, I expect that you will be able to answer this question after the class, so that when you see this diagram and you see that in the beginning the colors are converging and all of the plants end up in pink, you will tell me which type of inheritance is this one. I also hope that at the end of this class you will be able to answer this question. So you can stop the video, and I hope that you will be able to answer this question. Also, I hope that after this lecture you can compare these two types of inheritance, here the blended inheritance and here the particular inheritance, and you can answer this question. You can fill the blank, what is happening here, what is happening here, and what is happening here. Today we will talk about the blending hypothesis. And maybe if you have seen the Campbell biology in the section of inheritance, they ask this question. Do traits are actually blended? So for example, when you have red flowers or red plants and white plants, are you going to produce an intermediate? So are you going to have pink plants? And their big question is why? Why? What will be the molecular mechanism that allow us to get this? So this hypothesis proposed that the characteristics of parents are blended. And although I will show you today that this hypothesis is obsolete, this blended hypothesis is obsolete, as we watch with Darwin, with Aristotle, and with all these scientists, we found that experiments are very important. And although in some cases this will be actually what happened in some cases with some plants, the mechanism that the blended inheritance propose is wrong. And actually only by studying Mendelian inheritance we will understand why this actually takes place. So in few lectures we will talk more about Mendelian inheritance. Today I will focus on telling you that this mechanism of blended inheritance is wrong. So the blended inheritance have many inspirations, and one of those was artificial selection. And artificial selection in the times of Darwin was a very important idea. Why? Because it worked. If you take males that were very big and females that were very big, you're going to get a super progeny. Like this one, you're going to have the largest animal, and this will be very productive. And although we didn't know how this work, how selective breeding work, we didn't know anything about genes, that was a very powerful idea. And actually in England, this idea, many people was doing a lot of selective breeding of livestock, and they start finding results. Even Darwin was inspired by those experiments to try to propose his idea of natural selection. So person like Robert Bakewell was one of the most important figures of the British agriculture, and he actually did a lot of systemic selective breeding of livestock. And from those, it seems that when you take the super males and the super female, you're blending their traits, and in that way you can get a super progeny. However, as I said before, there was no mechanism. We didn't know exactly what was happening. And even Darwin found inspiration on those ideas, and as we watched in the previous class, he tried to explain all these ideas of inheritance, but they were so complex, as we talked last time, that we couldn't explain them. And one of them is what happened with this blending of inheritance. So I want that you remember 4 key concepts from blending inheritance. First one, that this idea is obsolete. So this is obsolete, and this idea was popular in the 19th century. But now we know that it's not true. Second thing that I want that you remember, that blended inheritance, and if you want, you can see again this schematic. If you see here, you have white flowers and red flowers, and here white and red. And what you're doing, when you have white and red, in the average of those will be pink. And this is what happened every generation. You will start getting the flowers will start getting more similar and more similar and more similar. So here you start getting even the next generation look more similar, and at the end, in few generations, what you're going to have is that all of them will look like the same. So again, in this hypothesis, the progeny inherits any characteristic as the average of the parent's value. So from red and white, the average will be, in this case, pink. And the third thing that I want that you remember from this schematic is that all the traits will converge into a single coloration. So in few generations, everything will be the same. And this has huge implication, and we will discuss why in the future slides. And the last thing that I wanted you to remember is when Mendel appeared, we found that although these things can sometimes happen, the mechanism that they proposed of the average, they were wrong. So this idea is obsolete until we're able to understand what happened with Mendel. So blended inheritance was discarded. And when it was accepted, the particulate Mendelian inheritance in the 19th century. Okay, so 4 key ideas that some of them will appear in your test. In the following slides, I'm going to talk about the relationship with blended inheritance and natural selection. And first, I want to tell you that you remember that Darwin and Mendel, although they were contemporaries, they were never able to meet each other. So although Darwin highly influenced and inspired Mendel's work, this was not reciprocal. Darwin was never able to meet or even read his work. Actually, as we will study later, Mendel's works had to be rediscovered a few decades later because nobody actually read it or paid a lot of attention to that. And so, as we watched last time, unfortunately, Darwin was so confused to some degree. He didn't know. He was very interested to understand how inheritance works. So, if you remember, he proposed this idea of pangenesis, and he was constantly thinking, changing about this idea of inheritance. So for some time, he actually considered that the idea of blended inheritance was correct. And why? Because there was no competing hypothesis that explained inheritance. So this is why he started even proposing his own idea. So everybody started studying inheritance. However, the idea of blended inheritance is not compatible with natural selection. And I will explain why. So here you have in this diagram the ideas of blended inheritance, and here the particular inheritance of Mendel. And if you see here, you end up here with an average. So all of them look the same. So they all converge. There is no variation. While here, in the ideas of Mendel, you find a lot of variation. So when you start with both, in generation 1, you start with traits that look very different. After multiple generations, you end up with similar traits here, while according to Mendel, you will end up with a lot of variation. And that was fundamental for the ideas of natural selection. And I would explain the future of why. One of the key problems of blended inheritance is that it doesn't allow to explain adaptations. For example, if you have plants that live in an environment that is white, I don't know if there is snow, for example, and you have the mother and the dad that have different colors, and here, contrary to the blended inheritance, all of them will be pink. And in this case, the one that will survive, the one that will be able to hide, it will be the ones that are white. However, and in this way they will adapt. However, here all of them will be pink. all of them will be the same. So while Darwin was looking for variation, and that can explain adaptation, here you cannot explain variation. So Darwin had this big problem that he could not explain inheritance. Yeah, the word gene didn't exist. So as he couldn't explain inheritance, everybody started asking, okay, so what is the mechanism? So he could have said, the problem is not natural selection, but blending, and say, I don't know what is the mechanism of the inheritance, and in the future we can answer those things, but definitely is not blended inheritance. So there are more problems with blended inheritance and natural selection. So for example, if blended inheritance was correct, a trait, an adaptation that already is adjusted to a specific environment, will be constantly diluted and will lose the perfect adaptation to a specific environment. Why? Because the traits will be successfully diluted. So here, this family, you see that all of them look similar, and this is actually true. Like, not only that family, but all the families, they look like the parents. In this case, this family that have many Hollywood stars, the kids look like their parents, and this is true. However, the mechanism of average all the traits is not the correct mechanism that explain inheritance. So although this phenomena is correct, the mechanism again is wrong. So to conclude, and this could be a question that I ask you in the test, if you see here there is two felines, one adapt to the jungle and the another one adapt to a place where there is snow, and the fur change. If the blended inheritance was correct, natural selection could not maintain a favorable trait, so they will lose this specific fur, and here the same thing will happen. And what actually Darwin proposed is that, when the environment change, as there is so much variation explained by the particulate inheritance of Mendel, some traits become different and some traits become superior. If you move this guy here, he will not survive, and if you move this guy here, the fur is not going to be useful. So blended inheritance is not correct, and natural selection, as we have talked for several classes, is actually correct. So now I want to talk about how much of the blended inheritance is true and how much is wrong. So we have been talking about looking for a mechanism, and I have told you that one of the problems of blended inheritance is that the phenomena is correct, but the mechanism is wrong. So for example, now we know that there are continuous and discontinuous traits, and in both cases you can find cases where the phenomena of blended inheritance is correct. So for example, in continuous traits, and in this case you have here the height, here you have the height in inches, and here you have the number of individuals, and if you see, most of them, the majority are on the average. So you have few short people in this figure and few tall people, and most of them go to the average, and this is something that is common in terms of height. So this phenomena is correct, but the blending inheritance is not the reason why people have this height, and in class we will talk about more about height. That is a very interesting trait, and for example, height has been increasing depend on over to the type of food. So for example, immigrants families that come to North American countries, the first generation, they increase in height, so environment actually play an important role. Also, you have discontinuous traits. Yeah, well, this one was a continuous one. You can have here a discontinuous one. Here you have white, red, and pink, and definitely this is true. You can, when you mix them, they can be pink. Although this phenomenon, we will study that later, is correct, the mechanism is wrong. And only Mendel, when we study Mendel, we're able to understand why these things happen. So remember, we can have continuous variation, so there is no distinct categories here. We just create this one short and tall, and it could be, we can give numbers here. However, we are creating those groups, and this one tend to be quantitative. They seem to be controlled by a lot of genes, and this seems to be a common characteristic of the genes like the height. So it's very difficult to predict exactly the height. And one of the reasons is because they are strongly influenced by the environment. As I said, the type of food that you have, how much quality of your food is very important to determine how tall you are. And on the other hand, you have this continuous variation. So in both cases, in the continuous or discontinuous traits, you can have examples of something that looks like blending, but in both cases, the mechanism is very different. In this case, there are distinct categories, and then seems to be qualitative, and in this case, there are few genes involved. However, opposite to this one, they seems to be unaffected by the environment. So I just wanted to show you that now we know more about why those traits behave like that. And with Mendel, as I said, this will be explained better. However, there are still many questions, and there are traits. These, for example, we will study later. These are called polygenic traits, and these traits are very difficult to predict because depend on many genes. These traits are much easier to understand because depend on few genes, and sometimes few genes there could be still difficult to understand, but they're relatively more easy to predict. So I hope that you understand much better what is blended inheritance, and that you remember that is obsolete right now. However, the phenomena are correct. So hopefully that was interesting for you, and in class we will talk more about this. Have a good day. Bye.